We're going to bring up our sports writers right now. Come on up, guys, and take a spot right behind your name. And we'll have them, just so you know who we're talking about, these are all writers that worked quite a bit with Hayden Fry, and that's what this is going to be about. We're talking about Hayden Fry. This is the first FRYfest that we've had. Obviously, last year there was no FRYfest where Hayden Fry hasn't been with us. So, first of all, we've got, have him stand up. Mike Holas has been a sports writer for the Cedar Rapids Gazette since 1980 and is a 6-time recipient of the Iowa Sports Writer of the Year. Mike Holas. Pat Hardy has covered Hawkeye athletics. Stand up, Pat. You already did? Okay. Since 1991, including 23 years as a beat reporter and columnist for the Press Citizen here in Iowa City. He now covers the Hawks with HawkFanatic.com. Steve Batterson. Steve has reported on the Hawkeyes since 1985 as a reporter for the Quad City Times. Before that, he earned his journalism degree while working for the Daily Iowan from 1980 to 1984. Steve Batterson. And finally, Rick Brown is a 10-time Iowa Sports Writer of the Year with the Des Moines Register. Starting in 1978 to 2015, he now covers the Hawkeyes for HawkeyeNation.com. And Rick Brown's actually his biggest claim to fame is he used to mow my lawn back in the 1970s. 70s. He actually was a student of ours in the sports information office, so he went on to do much greater things than working in the sports information office. And I don't know, I may not have even paid him for doing it. Well, anyway, your microphones are in front of you, so make sure you can turn them on and flip the switch up. And we're going to talk today about Hayden Fry stories. Like I said, Hayden, for the first time, is not with us. He's looking down on us at a FRYfest, and there's a lot of Hayden Fry stories. Most of them good, some of them probably not so funny. He was obviously a different kind of person. He was a psychologist, and he did a lot of things the old way. He did a lot of things the new way. But these guys have a lot of thoughts on Hayden Fry. And so, first of all, let's start with you, Steve, down at the other end, and just talk 3 or 4 minutes about the Hayden Fry that you remember. And we're not talking about, I guess, anything in retirement, but your recollections as a coach and your dealings with him.
Yeah, I think my first dealings were with him would have taken place when I was at the DI. Mike, you may have had similar experiences. One of our assignments was to go out to practice, or the end of practice, and wait outside the gate where it's where the CAN bus station is right now on the north side of Kinnick, was where the practice field was at that time, and both a representative from the DI and someone from the Press Citizen would go over and wait for practice to end each day. And Hayden then would come out and offer a brief report of what had transpired, at least what he wanted to be known that had transpired that day. And we would then send that into the wire services. Mine went into UPI, and I think probably in the Press Citizen obviously sent theirs to the Associated Press at that time. And it was a learning experience for a young guy right out of high school to come out and have a chance to chat with Hayden. And really, for the most part, he was always very cordial, very cooperative in those situations, but he wasn't going to tell you anything. This was the era when Hayden was sending his managers up into the parking ramp to make sure nobody was spying on what was going on behind those closed gates at practice, and that never changed. But we were there the night that Chuck Long was carted off on a golf cart. A couple of days prior to a game one year. Hayden denied it ever happened, despite the fact that there were two of us who watched Chuck get carted off. It proved to be nothing very serious, but he played that weekend. And Hayden would go to his grave denying the fact that Chuck had ever been carted off, even though we were right there in front and saw what happened. But obviously, he tweaked something, or at least something to the degree where they felt like it needed to be looked at. And but that was Hayden. I mean, Hayden was going to control the message whenever and however he wanted it to be spun on a given day and time. And you learn that there was a routine to practices from one day to the next. It became pretty apparent after doing that for a month or two. You would find out that typically the Tuesday practice might have been the worst practice in the history of practices anywhere, any place, anytime, and it was that way every single week. Wednesday, things might have been a little bit better. But after that, and then by Thursday, well, things were coming around a little bit. We're starting to see some hope. We might be able to play a game on Saturday, and there was a little psychology being put to use there, and certainly that was Hayden, and that was something that you learned over time, and that was a big part of why I think he had some success with the teams that he had. He knew how to get guys ready to play on a given day and time, and that usually started with one of the most miserable practices you've ever seen on a Tuesday, even though none of us ever had a chance to see one of those practices.
We almost didn't get to see him ourselves, and we were on the staff. So his usual comment was to us staff members, he says, you can come to practice whenever you want. But if somebody gets hurt and I see it out in the news, I know exactly who to come to. So we just figured we'd just stay away from practice, and that was the best way to stay on his good side. Pat, go ahead.
Okay, well, my first interaction with Hayden was my 9th grade year of high school. My brother was on the football team at Iowa. He was a redshirt freshman. He was in Bob Cummings' last recruiting class in 1978, so Hayden inherited his recruiting class, and my brother in the fall of '79 went in for knee surgery to get a bone chip taken out of his knee, and he got staph infection. He never played football again. He almost died. He almost lost his leg. But I saw a side of Hayden Fry during that, along with John Streif, that a lot of people didn't get to see. The human side of Hayden, how much he cared about his players. Hayden would visit my brother was a redshirt freshman linebacker way down on the depth chart. But when he was in the hospital, Hayden made a point of seeing him. Not every day, but if Hayden wasn't there, John Streif was there. Somebody from football was there from him. And I'll never forget Hayden telling my parents, we're going to take care of your son, even though he's done playing. We're going to watch over him like he's our own son. And my mom felt so reassured about that. So that was my first interaction with Hayden Fry, was seeing him as not only a coach, but as somebody who dealt with these kids away from football. And then this would have been 13 years later, I come to the Press Citizen and joined the beat and start covering Iowa. And I had the unique thing of writing game stories and columns, which lots of times you probably don't want to do that at newspapers, because you can, if you write your opinion, but you're also writing game stories, they can kind of overlap. And my first year on the beat in '92, I wrote a column, and I look back at that column, and it probably wasn't the smartest thing. I probably wouldn't have written that if I had a little bit more experience, and it really upset Hayden. And I had been warned at the Tuesday press conference, you may have been the one to warn me, that he was not happy. And I usually sat up toward the front. This day, I remember when we did the press conferences in that crowded, right when you walked into the football, I sat in the back of that room because I knew Hayden was going to unleash on me. And he did. And I remember it started with, Pat, where is Pat? Because I was kind of hiding in the background, and I'm like, here I am. And then he just went off. And he went off for about 15 minutes telling me what he thought was wrong with my column, and how, he felt betrayed, and how he didn't believe that I could do something like that. And I felt bad. I really did. I was embarrassed. I was young. But the thing about Hayden is he never held a grudge. We talked it out. I explained to him where I was coming from. He explained to me why he was upset. But he never held a grudge. Maybe that was because he liked my brother and my brother was on his team. But that's one thing I liked about Hayden, though. Lots of times he would use us to manipulate what was going on with his team. And that may have been one of those days where he wanted the attention taken away from his team, and he directed it toward me. But like I said, by the next Tuesday, it was business as usual, and he never did ever slight me again. He just treated me the same, but I upset him that day, and he let me know about it. And Phil, that's how Hayden operated. I mean, if he was upset, he'd let you know.
Yeah, and you'd rather have it that way than have him
Oh, without question.
just be hold it underneath and not.
And then hold a grudge and then treat you differently. No, with Hayden, you knew what. I mean, he would, like what Steve was saying, there was times where he would manipulate us, but with Hayden, if he was upset, you knew where he was coming from, and he would not sugarcoat it or anything. But no, my relationship was personal and professional, but I'll just never forget how he treated my brother and my family during the year of 1979. It was tough when your brother's taking a whole semester of classes in the hospital and he can't walk, and he's addicted to morphine because of all the stuff that he had to go through. But man, Hayden was there for him. He was a pillar of strength for my family.
He's you won't find a better person than Hayden Fry. One thing about Hayden, he was, from my standpoint, I'd be in his office for 10 or 15 minutes before the press conference would start, and he'd be really mad at maybe mad at something like Pat said right there. He says, he'd always say, this is not my contract. I don't have to do these press conferences. And I don't have to do this, and I don't have to do that. And he'd go down, damn it this and damn it that. He would walk into the door of the press conference all of a sudden, and he'd look and he'd say, "How y'all doing?" And he was always, he could change just like that. But that's the way he was. But he could also change the other way.
But he really cared about his players. He really did care about his players, and you could tell.
Now, as does Kirk. They're both unbelievably that way towards their players. But Mike, let me say something about Mike before he starts. I heard Hayden say a number of things that he didn't like about the stories that Mike wrote. I've heard Kirk say the same thing, and they both followed up by saying the same thing. I don't like what he's writing, but I can't disagree with him. And I can tell you that. He says, usually if Mike says something critical of our team, I may not like the fact that he wrote it, but he's probably right, and he's right on target. So that says something about Mike Holas.
Why did it take me so long to hear that?
That's a fact. They both said that.
Well, Pat was referring to, and what you just referred to about the blow-ups. Yeah, there were those, and they were famous, and they were vastly entertaining, I think, to a lot of Hawkeye fans. But I'm here to tell you that a lot more of those press conferences were lighthearted and had humor than had anger. And I wish I had $1 for every time they closed with Fry saying, "Did I fill your notebooks for you?" If he got one laugh, he'd go for 2. And if he got 2, he'd go for 10. The guy loved to laugh. And nobody thought his jokes were funnier than he did.
No, he laughed, yeah.
But the guy I got spoiled. The first I started covering Iowa football was 1985. That spoiled me rotten for 2 reasons. Number one, the team was number 1 in the country for 5 weeks? Yeah. Don't get that too often. And then secondly, I thought that football coaches were supposed to be funny and ornery and emotional and all over the place, and people who did fill up your notebooks all the time. And the more other football coaches I saw from around the country, the more I realized, no, this guy is the exception. He is definitely not the rule. And as a sports writer, I wanted my notebooks filled up, good, bad, or indifferent, and he got that job done for me.
There's no question he was and they'll probably talk about that later, a master psychologist. Quite often we would be playing Northwestern that week, and that was when Northwestern was really, really bad. They were not good at all. And quite often he would go into a press conference when we were playing somebody bad, he had to motivate his team, and he would go in and he'd have that look on his face. Just like that. Everything, there's nothing you could say. He was in a down mood, and he was, he's pissed off. And that's the way it was. By the same token, when we played a school like Michigan or Ohio State, he'd go in and he was all jokes. you know, he'd try and lighten up his team and it'd take the pressure off them by being lighthearted all week. But he would be mad when the team had to get fired up for somebody they weren't maybe supposed to get fired up for, and that's just the way he was.
Well, Bob Elliott, who was Hayden's last defensive coordinator, told me this once. He said, when things are going good for us, he takes it out on you guys. And when things are going bad for us, he takes it out on us. And I think that's 100% right.
And, he definitely was one of a kind. But, Rick, give us your thoughts on...
Well, I know back in the day, we used to we'd have an office pool. What week will Hayden go after the media? Just to have some fun. Because he
was always 1 week at least.
Once a year, yeah. But I remember, when he got hired, the first time I'd ever heard his name, Maury White, the Register columnist, had a little tidbit in a notes column saying, "Don't be surprised if Hayden Fry is named in Iowa." That's all it said. Great reporting, way to follow it up. It just said that. So, of course, he does get the job. First time I ever met him, back in the old iClub days, he was speaking in Fort Dodge, my hometown, so I went up there. Hayden was there, Jim Zaba was the MC, and he had those people eating out of his hands. I mean, Iowa fans, a lot of you were probably there during the time, inherited, 17 consecutive non-winning seasons, and people were hungry for a winner, man. It was like feeding goldfish. It was the most unbelievable thing that night, how he had everyone believing he was the Messiah. The other thing I remember is his handwriting, immaculate. He would write you a note. First year, he wrote Christmas cards to all the media people. You're going, "Hey, did you get something in the mail from Hayden?" "Yeah, I got a Christmas card." This Hawkeye stationery with the Tiger Hawk and the beautiful handwriting. And I was lucky because my dad was a sports writer. So that was my connection to Hayden. And Hayden liked my dad. And so every time I saw Hayden, "How's your pop doing?" Without a miss, he would always bring up my dad. And he, right when he got the job, I remember one time, he told you guys he was related to LBJ, right? Lyndon Baines Johnson. So Dan Peterson, reporter at the Register, did some digging into the archives. He wasn't related to LBJ. So he wrote that. And I don't know what the reaction was, but it disappeared from your media guide right after that. He also claimed he taught Roy Orbison to sing because he had him in class and put him in a corner with a dunce cap on, and so his voice would echo, and he thought, "Oh, that sounds pretty good." The stories were unbelievable. And Mike talked about filling notebooks, and that is so true, but the man had a great heart. He was a people person. I got lucky enough to play golf with him one time because Tom Davis was a Drake coach, and he had Hayden. Hayden came to play in his golf outing. And Tom paired me with Hayden so we wouldn't have fans bothering him. And, that's the first time I've heard the line, and he told me that every time after, "I'm the only man in captivity who can hook a putt." I bet I've heard that 200 times since then, at least. That was his favorite line. He would get a line and stick with it, but he had some great lines. And he was a tremendous football coach, and Iowa was lucky he came at the right time because if he hadn't come, who knows where Iowa football would be right now.
Well, in some of the stories where he did go, actually, to grade school with Roy Orbison, because he showed me the yearbook with he and Roy Orbison way back when he was in grade school, and then we thought he was pulling our leg again. He says, "Yeah," he says, "I'm great friends with George Bush," and a lot of us said, "Yeah, whatever," and all of a sudden, George Bush comes into town, and he said, this was after he was president, and said, "First thing, I got to meet with my good buddy Hayden." So they were good friends down in Texas.
Phil, he said that he rented George and Barbara Bush an apartment in Odessa. I didn't check that out, but it's a pretty good story.
It's a good story. Now we can go back to one. We're going to talk a little bit about a negative. Back in the early 1980s, Iowa was playing. I don't remember what team we played, but Iowa scored a touchdown on like the last play of the game, and we had like a 3 or 4 touchdown lead already. Indiana were playing, and there was a sportscaster with WMT in Cedar Rapids by the name of Howard James. Well, Howard James went off. Anybody remember? the name Howard James? Yes, some of you older ones like myself would. Well, Howard went off with a personal editorial saying that that was poor coaching, unsportsmanlike, and everything else of Hayden. Well, I think these guys can tell you right now how he came in to the press conference the next week. The bottom line is, advertisers started pulling out at WMT, and Howard James had to be fired. So, you didn't, because we had won that year before. So you weren't going to go down on Hayden Fry. I mean, he's the savior after 20-some years of losing, and you didn't want to do anything to lose him. So everybody backed Hayden on that deal, but poor Howard James, I mean, he gave an editorial and he paid the price for it, with Hayden. What do you guys say?
That doesn't surprise me. That was before my time, but that's what I appreciate about my story, because I thought I was maybe in the wrong with what I wrote. I didn't pay the price, though. Hayden gave me another chance, and maybe it's because he did like my brother, and maybe it's because my brother did play for him, but he gave me another chance, and he didn't hold a grudge against me. But what I liked about Hayden, I remember in the summer of '95 going to the Big Ten kickoff luncheon in Chicago. Back then, we didn't see the coaches during the summer. We didn't see them much during the spring because they didn't have media press conferences like we do now. So I hadn't seen Hayden since April, and he sees me in the lobby of the hotel, and I go up and say hi. He looks at me, and he always called me Patty. And he goes, Patty, I don't know what you did this summer, but it obviously wasn't sit-ups. And that was Hayden's way of saying that it looked like I had gotten a little heavy during the summer. And I'll never forget that. That was his way of saying, hey, you need to exercise a little bit. And I remember he did that Jell-O laugh afterward. You know how he would laugh really hard at his jokes? And he said that to me, and I'll just never forget that. But it motivated me to lose some weight. That was Hayden's way of, and that's just how he was. I mean, he just had an aura about him.
Well, and maybe Mike or Rick remembers this, but the next Tuesday when we had our press conferences, Hayden came into the press conference after the Howard James editorial and that on the air, and he sat behind the desk with all the microphones, and basically it was like this. Every question, I think he just said, yes, no. Everything was right to the point you could tell. He was, finally, I think it was Ron Gonder or somebody said, Coach, what the heck's wrong?
That was the shortest Hayden Fry press conference in history, as I recall. Very brief. But, we're talking about how he manipulated the media or used the media to his psychological advantage. And that's all he was doing. I don't think, maybe Pat, because he mentioned you personally, but every week when he got on the media, he was motivating his team. Yeah. The 1990 Iowa plays Illinois. Illinois is 5th in the country. Untouchable, great defense. And he refused to talk. He wouldn't, poor boy in the Iowa media, and wouldn't talk to anyone from Illinois in the media that week. And then Iowa goes out, Nick Bell runs wild. Iowa destroys Illinois 45-28, but it wasn't that close. And after the game, Hayden Nick Bell, Nick Bell, sorry. And after the game, Hayden apologizes to the Illinois media for not returning their calls. An all-timer.
That's just the way he was. Go ahead, Pat.
Phil, do you remember the 1995, the Think Big campaign? Remember when you guys had the Think Big logo for athletics? And Iowa went out to play Ohio State and was down 56-0 in the second quarter. And all the newspapers wrote snarky leads, think big, think not. And, oh, man, by Tuesday, Hayden was really upset. And I'll never forget, he unloaded on us, and I'll never forget him saying, what do you want us to do? Think small? And then he started to say, that wasn't my idea. And then he started throwing sports marketing under the desk. It was hilarious. And that was his way of, he was upset with the way his team played. I mean, they came back and scored 35 points in the second half, but the game was over. It was 56-0 in the second quarter. And we never wrote about the Think Big campaign ever again after that. But when he said, what do you want us to do? Think small? That made me laugh. And then he did make it obvious that it was not his idea to do the Think Big campaign. You remember that campaign? It was back in '90. It was pretty funny.
He said, that wasn't me, that was Ricky Cladd.
Yeah, I didn't know. He goes, that was Ricky Cladd, and he called him Ricky. And I'll never forget that.
He was definitely something else. He loved to take the pressure off his team whenever he could by either being mad at the media or being mad at this person or being mad. But the other people that took the brunt hostility, if there ever was one, that we didn't see was his assistant coaches. Carl Jackson told me, he says, oh yeah, he says, during the course of a season, he said, I get fired 5-6 times. He says, and then after practice, he rehires me. So,
hey, Phil, do you remember Kirk told me this story when he and McCarney were coaching one offensive line, defensive line, and in practice they went ones against one. Well, Hayden never wanted ones against ones in practice. They go, oh, he won't notice. Let's go down here and do a little ones on ones. Hayden came running out of the field. Kirk, Dan, what are you doing? We don't go one-on-one. And Kirk thought he was fired that day. That was his first year there. So he, and you talk about the psychological thing. We haven't mentioned the pink locker room. That's clearly what that was. And you remember the 85 game, once again, 1-2, Michigan. There I go again. Schembechler had student managers tape, brown paper over that whole locker room. Well, Hayden was just chuckling. He says, I got him where I want him. And then you remember what he did in the pregame. He had a guard snapping to the punter and snapping all over the place. And Bo says, Hayden, you're not going to let that guy snap in the games, are you? And Hayden says, don't plan on punting, Bo. The guy he was thinking ahead, 2 steps ahead all the time.
He had an unbelievable sense of humor, and something a lot of people don't realize, the guy had an unbelievable memory. He was on Jim Zabel's call-in show one night, and a guy called in from Texas. Said, Hayden, you don't remember me, but I met you in a truck stop in Odessa 10 years ago. And Hayden says, is that you, Harley? And he said, yeah, it is. And he was just that kind of guy, and he's got, I don't know what you want to call it, perfect recall or what, but he remembered faces, he remembered names. He'd go to clubs all over the state, and he'd remember somebody he met once the year before, and that's just kind of guy he was.
Well, you remember the 1995 Sun Bowl when Iowa upset Washington. I believe Greg Smith from the Associated Press was the only one to pick Iowa to win in before the game. And after they won, boy, Hayden let us know. He thanked Greg Smith, and then basically let us all know that we were a big part of Iowa's motivation for that game, because none of us thought Iowa was going to win that game. Just one guy did, but he followed us maybe closer than he would lead on. But I'll never forget in that post game, he wanted to start by thanking the one guy who picked Iowa to win the game, and then the rest of us were idiots.
Who was that one guy?
Greg Smith from the Associated Press.
Okay. Yeah.
Hayden was always at its best at bowl games because he had a new audience to preach to. I can remember the Alamo Bowl one year when he told everybody about his great second cousin, 3 times removed, Benjamin Franklin Fry, who just happened to have been at the Alamo. And of course, the reporters are there just eating it up. I mean, again, it was a notebook filler. And, those stories, there was always a local twist to it that seemed to captivate the local audience. And it was one of those things that it separated Hayden from the pack. There's no question about that. But, I don't think there probably was a Benjamin Franklin Fry at the Alamo. I think if we really dig into it. But, I do think that certainly, it made for great copy and people soaked it up. I mean, because that's who he was and a great part of his legacy, no question.
Timing, I think, is everything. And a wonderful person that I knew, I thought, wonderful person and an excellent coach, Todd Licklider, Iowa basketball. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong school. Everything was wrong. Nothing was lined up for him to do well here at Iowa. On the other hand, Hayden comes to Iowa, 19 straight losing seasons. Look over there on that bus. Look at that staff that he put together here at Iowa. Virtually every person in that staff picture was successful for Hayden. It was the right time, the right place, the right school, the right bosses that he had in Bump Elliott. The stars were perfectly aligned for Hayden to make it. I'm one of these guys. I truly don't think anybody in the country could have done what Hayden Fry did at Iowa.
It's unlikely. I mean, I'm a believer that in major college football you can win anywhere. And I think it's been proven. I mean, we never thought Northwestern could be any good. They have been. We never thought, I mean, Kansas State was the worst program in the country. Bill Snyder went down there and made it just a superb program. Iowa was a dead football program. It just couldn't get over the hump. Fry looked at it and he saw what it could be, not what it was. That's what Bump Elliott had to have. He was Elliott's third hire. And Bump told Hayden, you know, it doesn't matter what happens if you don't win because neither one of us are going to be around here. And he was right. I mean, Bump struck out twice, and Bump was a football man himself, and he knew, you got to get this thing right this time. So give Bump all the world in the credit for plucking Fry. And other schools did want Fry, but the reason Fry came here is because he knew that Bump Elliott would let him be autonomous. He would let Hayden run the show, run the football show. Fry's experience at SMU was sour. He couldn't run the show. There were a lot of cooks stirring that pot down there, a lot of donors with too much influence, a lot of people who disagreed with the way he did things. He brought in Jerry Leviathan, and it's a well-established fact that he broke the color barrier in the Southwest Conference, and he gets nothing but hosannas for it, you know, 60 years later. But at the time, it was extraordinarily unpopular with a lot of people, not only in that conference, but at his own school. And so he never won everybody over, and he never got a real handle on the program. He said, I'm never going to do that again. The next big job I get, I'm going to be the boss or I'm not going. Bump Elliott said, this is your show, man. And he had the faith in Fry, and in turn, Fry rewarded him. And the rest is history. You know, you're now going on 4 solid decades of winning football here.
You know, we asked Don Patterson last week on the radio what one thing would he say stood out when Hayden took over here, why he was able to be successful. And he finally came down to the way Hayden embraced the current players on the roster. A lot of head coaches, when they get a new job, they want their people, the recruits they have. I remember reading in the paper, Hayden's like, man, we got some angry, hungry football players on this team. He opened his arms up to the Pat Deans and all. He knew that these guys could be good. They were hungry. They were angry. He embraced those guys, and those were the guys that ended up winning for him early. A lot of Bob Cummings' players helped Hayden get over the hump, but that was because Hayden made them feel welcome. He made them feel like this was their team, even though I didn't recruit you. And Patterson said that was huge. That's where everything started.
Well, in my thinking is, too, that you had Dan Gable. You had, later in the 80s, Vivian Stringer.
Lute Olson.
You had all kinds, you know, of people that were successful. Lute Olson in the department. Tom Davis came in. But I think the intangible was Hayden Fry, who basically turned the nation's view of Iowa athletics into not even mediocrity, what was, you know, the doormat, to something to be proud of as far as Iowans are concerned.
I'll jump in and then I'll stop talking for a while, but I just wanted to say this, that maybe the biggest thing Fry did besides make the football team a winner was give the university that logo that you're wearing right now and that so many of you are wearing. When that logo came out, I think a lot of people looked at it and said, you know, what in the world is that? I mean, that's a strange looking thing. And it wasn't a common thing for teams to come up with logos. Fry wanted identity. You know, the uniforms that they came out with his first year were rip-offs of the Pittsburgh Steelers, but the Pittsburgh Steelers were champions. And he knew that that if his players wore those uniforms, they'd feel a little better about themselves, and the fans would feel better about them. It was just, I mean, we talk about the psychology. He was a psychology major at Baylor. He never stopped putting that to use. And, you know, here we are today. That logo will never go away. That logo unites Hawkeye fans from here to Tijuana, you know? And that was one guy's vision. That was a football coach's vision.
It was.
And that logo.
In fact, so many people made fun of it.
Yeah.
You remember what they called it when you turned it sideways? Fred Flintstone.
Yeah,
Yeah. From the
absolutely.
Flintstones. If you turned the Tiger Hawk sideways, it looked a little bit like Fred Flintstone, and they were laughing at it. But then when you go to the Rose Bowl once or twice, and all of a sudden, like Mike said, the entire world knows that's the Iowa Hawkeyes now.
And the fans were able to buy into it because that logo was available at every JCPenney store from Council Bluffs to Davenport. And at that time, JCPenney was on every town square in this state as well. He brought Iowa football into all of those communities, even more so than it always had been. And that made it easy for fans to connect with what was going on in Iowa City.
And when all of this happened, he embraced the fans too. He wasn't somebody that stayed on the sidelines aloof or anything like that. Anytime he went to a nightclub, and much the same with Kirk Ferentz, they're there. When they're done speaking, they stay and shake hands with everybody and say hello to everybody until the last person's gone. I think we're unbelievably lucky and blessed over the last 40 years for a Hayden Fry and a Kirk Ferentz. We know there aren't any other schools in the country that have had two coaches over a total of 40 years.
That's amazing when you think that it started with, well, it was 17 consecutive non-winning seasons. Then Hayden had 2 more, so it got up to 19. And then they went to the Rose Bowl in '82. But you're absolutely right. He was the right man at the right time, I'll tell you. And the way he did it was unorthodox for what people around here were used to. You know, so some of his one-liners got him into trouble, like Hayden's little dumplings. Remember, that was a big issue. And I think when he started with the Tiger Hawk with the hat right over there on the wall with the scrambled eggs and the merchandising, he got called on the carpet for that. Something happened where he couldn't have exclusive. The university had to have merchandising rights. He couldn't have it on his own, his company. But his vision was amazing. And, you know, you bridging the gap with Coach Ferentz. I think it's the last time I ever talked to Hayden in person. He was back for something, and I said, you know, that big, beautiful football building over there, I says, ought to make you feel good because that's there because of you. And he looked at me, and he looked over, and he says, hope they got my address. They're going to send me that check. You know, he's always thinking. The man was always thinking.
He says, I just was working at the wrong time. But can you imagine? I mean, you think about it now. Kirk Ferentz is Kirk Ferentz because of Hayden Fry. Barry Alvarez was a high school coach in Mason City, and Hayden Fry brought him in. I mean, Bill Snyder was with them, but all of these people that are Hall of Fame coaches now and successful in their own right because of Hayden Fry. So I think arguably it could be maybe one of the finest coaching staffs ever put together in college football. Wouldn't you think?
Oh, without question. I mean, I don't think there's any way to dispute that. And the thing with Hayden, everyone talks about his offense and the exotics and all that. He had the breakthrough with a punter and defense. That's how they won the '81 Big Ten Championship, with a great defense filled with a bunch of Bob Cummings recruits and Reggie Roby. I remember Dan McCarney telling the story about when Reggie committed to Iowa. I think it was down to Iowa and Wisconsin or Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken. They celebrated. They knew that was the guy that they needed. That was the guy that would help their breakthrough. And their '81 offense, you remember, Phil, it was nothing electrifying. But they had a great defense, and they had a punter who dominated field position, and that's how they won.
You know, that's, to me, the most underrated man on that staff was Bill Brazier, the defensive coordinator.
I would agree with that.
Coach Snyder did great things at K-State, and, you know, Kirk's done great things, and you go right down the line, Barry Alvarez of Wisconsin. But Bill was comfortable being an assistant coach, and he was one heck of a defensive coordinator. And Hayden gave him the reins, let him, okay, we'll go with what you tell me. And that, to me, was one of the secrets to success to Hayden Fry is Bill Brazier.
Similar with Kirk and Norm Parker in some ways. Yeah, I always saw a lot of similarities with that. But yeah, Bill Brazier still lives in Iowa City, like 2 blocks from me. He's been in the same house for years, and I think he's one of the most underrated coaches ever. You could listen to him talk about defensive leverage for hours. He just knows so much about defense. It's amazing.
You know, and I think it's a very similar situation with Norm Parker, the way he was with the Hawkeyes and the way Phil Parker is now. And You know, Kirk didn't even bother with the defense when Norm was around, and now I don't think he even looks that way with Phil around.
Well, Iowa's had 4 defensive coordinators in the last 40 years. I mean, that says something.
It doesn't. It says something about the head coach hiring the right person.
You know, Kirk tells the story. It was Iowa Northwestern. It was his first big rated victory over a Big Ten team of note was Northwestern of all teams, 27-17. But Kirk thought they should go about the game a certain way defensively. Norm had a completely different idea. So you know what Kirk did? He told Norm, "It's your baby. We'll go with what you say." And it worked to perfection. Same with the Orange Bowl, and Kirk in the Orange Bowl with how to stop the
Georgia Tech.
The Georgia Tech, you know, the triple option. It's your baby, Norm. That to me is you got to be a head coach with a lot of confidence, and people think of Hayden as this bigger than life guy, but Hayden let his assistants do the coaching. He knew he had the right people in line. He might have some input. He let them do their thing, and that to me is the secret of a great head coach.
Yeah, I know there's a famous story with his assistants that he kept them there till midnight working. Well, he would come out of his office about 11:30, and they're all just going through film, Hayden Fry staff, and Barry Alvarez used to always tell the story, and Dan McCarney, he'd come out yawning and rubbing his eyes. They could tell he was maybe sleeping in his office, but then he'd come out and say, "Well, I think it's time we go home." But why don't you, let's start with Steve down at the end there. In closing here, just give your final thoughts on what you think the legacy of Hayden Fry, and where do you think in 10, 15, 20 years we'll be remembering her?
Yeah, you know, Hayden is going to be one of those guys who will always be remembered as a legend in this town. You know, I mean, he has a street named after him. I mean, those things don't happen to average coaches, and Hayden was far from average. He showed up here at a time when Iowa fans were begging for a winner in football. They were still so supportive of the program, but they needed that W at the end of the day. He took this place to places it hadn't been in decades. You know, that 1981 team in the 82 Rose Bowl that ended Michigan and Ohio State's stronghold on that. I mean, that was an era where that kind of stuff didn't happen. But this man came from Texas and turned it all around. And, you know, he's provided a lot of programs with a lot of hope. He's used as an example still to this day at different places around, just from the standpoint of how he took this program that had just been spinning its wheels and really it had become irrelevant and made it relevant again. And that's a great compliment to his ability and what he was able to accomplish at a place where it's not easy to win football games. And Kirk reminds us of this all the time. This is not an easy place to win, and you have to have the right pieces in place to make it happen. And Hayden was able to take those pieces, put them together, and it happened. And it happened again and again and again. That's Hayden Fry's legacy.
He showed it could be done with the right person in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Hayden did what I think a lot of us thought was impossible. I mean, I've talked to you about it, but when he got hired, you guys were starting to wonder if you could ever win again in football. And he was able to do it, and he did it the right way. He embraced the current players that were here. He was bigger than life, but in a lot of ways he wasn't. He let the people around him do their coaching because he trusted them. He hired people that he knew had big goals, and he wanted to use those people to make Iowa win. But he also, I thought, approached it from a business sense too. He rebuilt more than a football program. I thought in a lot of ways he rebuilt the athletic program. He gave it an identity. He figured out a way to make money on it for the university, to bring stability. But he was bigger than life, but he also kept himself with the common person too. I never felt like Hayden was upstaging us when he was in it. He always cared about us, but he had a way, he was just bigger than life because of the way he lived. I mean, when Hayden Fry walked into a room, you knew he was there. People used to say the same thing about Forrest Evashevsky. They just had an aura about them, and I think Hayden knew that. But yeah, he did the impossible. But for me, personally, it's the way he treated my brother during a really scary point in our family's life. And I knew my brother was one of hundreds of football players that he treated that way over the years. What he did with Jerry Leviathan took courage and strength. he really loved his football players. I used to drop my mom notes in the mail saying, hey, your son's doing real well. He would update my mom more than my brother would update my mom on how he's doing in the class. And he had so many other things on his mind, but he still thought about injured players who weren't playing for him anymore. And to me, that's the genius of Hayden Fry.
Well, and before you speak, Mike, the one thing I think that people underestimate a little bit, you said what he did for the team, what he did for the athletic department. I think it's what he did for the university itself, because the number of contributions, believe me, the contributions did not increase for the University of Iowa because we increased the number of books in our library. But when we went to the Rose Bowl, that meant more contributions for every single department at the University of Iowa, and it was a big plus for everybody. So the Hayden factor was in the athletic department, in the football team, and the entire university, and I'll go so far as to say the entire state of Iowa.
Well, I mean, if you turn around and look at that big sign up there, FRYfest. It's been 23 years since he's been the coach here. I mean, 23 years is a long time, and they're still having a FRYfest here. Why is that? Well, yeah, he was a big winner, okay, but it's charisma. It's more than that. It's tugging heartstrings. It's making people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. That's why people follow sports. They hope that they can experience that at some point with their teams. And at Iowa they did, and you don't forget that. His teams in the 1990s weren't nearly as good as his teams in the 1980s. They just weren't. His coaching staffs in the 90s weren't as good as the ones in the 80s. And his staff in the 80s, as you guys discussed, was sensational. It didn't last. I mean, he had ordinary staffs, I would say, in the 90s. Not bad, just ordinary. The teams, compared to the 80s teams, weren't as good. They had their moments, but they weren't as good overall. It didn't matter, because he built up so much goodwill that you've never heard anybody say, the old man doesn't have it anymore, it's time to go. It's like, no, he can do this as long as he wants, he deserves whatever he wants, etc., etc. And you know what, you can go on down the line at 90% of the football programs in major college football and ask them, who was the coach 23 years ago? They won't even know. Even if they were winners, they might not remember. This one, I think, people won't forget for decades to come.
I agree. No question, he was one of a kind, and he did what I think you have all said in one way or another. He did what everyone thought was impossible, and much the same with Bill Snyder at Kansas State, and that's something he'll never be forgotten for. Rick?
You know, he came in here with a lot of sayings, scratch where it itches and plowing up snakes and killing them. I'll never forget those. But there was a moment in his first year that I think really sent a message about what this Hayden Fry guy was about. Played the opener against Indiana, had a 26-3 halftime lead, lost because they sent a running back out of the backfield, Lonnie Johnson. No one picked him up. Went untouched for a touchdown with less than a minute to go. Crushing loss, okay. The next week, they're at Oklahoma. They have to play at Oklahoma, then they have Nebraska at home, both in the top 10. So they go to Oklahoma. Iowa was right there. It was 7-6 at halftime. They lose 21-6. But a very competitive game. And Hayden sensed that his players were being patted on the back and told them what a great job they did. And some reporter after the game said, Hayden, you guys really played well. He went off. In fact, he gave the famous line, which he'd probably get fired for now. He said, if I see one of my players smiling, I'm going to bust them in the mouth. Well, we all now talk about culture. It's an overused word in sports. But you got to create an atmosphere where it's conducive to winning. And that moment, to me, he sent a message, this is the way we're going to do it, and by golly, he got it done.
He got it done. Thanks, guys. I want to tell everybody out there we're going to continue talking about Hayden Fry with the next panel. Just so you know, Don Patterson, Marv Cook, myself, and Dale Ahrens, who was very close to Hayden in the latter part of his life. But for now, how about a nice hand for Steve Batterson, Pat Hardy, Mike Loss, and Rick Brown for all your great memories on the man that was the man, Hayden Fry, and that's why we're here today for FRYfest. So thank you all.